And then, of course, Foucault himself was a man who had very unconventional affections, and of course, you know, through personal choice, you know, the objects of his affection were members of the same sex. So I suppose you would have called him gay, but you know, he wasn't gay in the conventional sense. But at the same time, he felt, you know, the terrible brunt of homophobia. Don't forget that when he lived, you know, being gay was being sort of like involved effectively with members of your own sex was something still vilified. There were no gay marriages allowed in any country in the world. In fact, they were criminalized, you know, for the most part. Yeah, this was before the, you know, there used to be a general ban against that kind of behavior in the armed forces, for example, of many military systems in the world, including that of the United States. Until recently, Obama struck it down and so forth and so on. So now it's not an issue anymore, but it used to be, you know. And he lived at the time when it was an issue. The deepening, when I first went to the States in 1987 for my graduate studies, the AIDS crisis was raging largely because of homophobia. In other words, research dollars were not being allocated to the proper, you know, research in the work of developing drugs against HIV and AIDS at the time, and so forth and so on. And so the gay men in his own generation were dying like flies, and he himself eventually contracted the disease and was among those that died in 1984 of AIDS, and so forth and so on. So in other words, he was a person who was sensitive to the fact that a lot of people in the world were, you know, the targets precisely of very violent homophobia. And so, he wrote the history of sexuality, an interrogation of the sexual identity formations involving homosexuality, but also involving the incarceration of women in their own gender, and to a certain extent, the incarceration of men in sort of like, you know, protocols of masculinity that were not always very favorable to them. And then, of course, the idolatrization of the compulsory appropriated, you know, legally defined heterosexual family, which hid a multitude of sins, and so forth and so on. So in other words, he demanded that all those institutions be critically interrogated, you know, in a sense, so that precisely maybe improvements could be brought in.